Inequality is at a 75-year high and rising. 2.5 million Australians live in poverty. I'll touch on super and early childhood education as areas that are in need of reform ahead of the next election. So I'm going to get a little philosophical. What is inequality? Is there anything wrong with it? What does it mean? Should we all be equal? And if so, equal in relation to what? And what exactly about our lives should be equal? In A Theory of Justice, the American political philosopher John Rawls put forward the idea that we should approach the question of inequality from behind a veil of ignorance about our own real social status. So let's assume we don't know our wealth or our gender, our income, because then, he said, you will design a society that guarantees basic freedoms and that provides a basic level of support in case you or one of the people you love happens to end up in that group, in the underprivileged group. Rawls said that none of us deserve our natural talents, they are accidents of birth, and we should design our societies with that in mind, and I wholeheartedly agree. So there are two kinds of inequality: political inequality or formal inequality, and equality of opportunity or substantive inequality. Substantive equality. The concept of formal equality, of course, underpins our democracy. From the Enlightenment onwards, we've accepted that as humans we have a basic worth. So the idea that human beings are born free and equal and therefore deserve the equal protection of the law underpins our democracy. And the International Human Rights Framework, of course, gives meaning to that. Article 26 of the International Covenant on International and Civil and Political Rights says that all people are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to the equal protection of the law. It goes on to say that no person can be discriminated against on the grounds of race, colour, sex, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. And Carl's going to go on to talk about marriage equality, but for me that's the end of the debate. No person is below the law and no person is above it. To act otherwise threatens the fundamental principle underpinning our social contract and our democracy. The other type of equality, of course, is more challenging. Equality of what? Income, opportunity, access. Almost no one now defends pure egalitarianism. I think what is important is not sameness, but that we all have enough to live decent and dignified lives. Of course, if equality of opportunity is not provided, then ultimately political equality is undermined, because your freedom is worth little more than the paper it's written on if you don't have a home, if you can't access your democratic rights. So, particularly in Melbourne, Labor and the Liberal Party are often accused of being the same. This is a self-indulgent untruth. At a fundamental level, Labor, unlike the Coalition, accepts that it's the role of governments to make equality a practical reality for its citizens. Labor, unlike the Coalition, accepts that it's the role of government to address market inequalities and ensure access to education, decent working conditions, and make provision for sickness and old age. Idealism is part of Labor's tradition. Labor has always believed in an ethical state which intervenes to support its citizens by building a just and inclusive society where the opportunity for self-development is a reality for all individuals, regardless of their wealth, social status or gender. So we've been out in the community in Melbourne for many months now. I was just saying it's been the longest campaign ever. I was pre-selected in May. I started campaigning for those votes in February. So it's just ticked over for a year, and the fun part hasn't even started. So people have been... The themes in Melbourne are quite consistent. Probably they're indicative of what's going on in democracies around the world. Every second person says that they're disappointed in politics. There's a general dissatisfaction and frustration with politics itself, with democracy itself. On one hand, this is pretty hard to swallow. These people are enjoying an incredibly high standard of living. 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth puts these Melburnians at probably one of the highest standards of living on earth. But on another level, I understand their cynicism and their concern. Climate change, rapid technological and demographic shifts means that our future really has never been less certain. And policymakers around the world have struggled to come up with a convincing, coherent plan to address the challenges we face. And this is partly, of course, as people have pointed out, because globalisation, neoliberalism and the rise of anti-democratic forces such as corporations have rendered governments weaker, should throw in their free trade agreements, and investor-state provisions have rendered governments weaker than they've ever been before, at a time, paradoxically, when we need them most of all. In Australia, we face unprecedented challenges, summarised accurately, I think, by George Megalogenis as gridlocked cities, explaining the lateness of some of our guests, growing inequality in a corporate sector that feels no obligation to pay tax. Productivity, business investment and wages have stalled. We have massive amounts of private debt, most of it foreign, and mostly for housing, and some of the highest housing prices in the world. Our export base is narrower than ever and focused on mining even as the industry wanes. And of course, years of neoliberal policy has resulted in increasing inequality, which has been outlined by Kelvin, which undermines economic performance as well as our social contract. Wealth inequality is higher than ever before in Australia. The wealthiest fifth of households hold nearly 2/3 of Australia's net wealth. In Victoria, more than 100,000 people do not know where their next meal is coming from, and many of those people are children. More than 20,000 people don't have access to permanent housing. So housing and super are massive parts of this problem. 1.5 million Australians own more than one home, while 2/3 of those under 30 still rent. And I'm no longer anywhere near close to under 30, but I do still rent. I'm essentially locked out of the housing market. There's no chance on earth of me buying a 2-bedroom house in Carlton anytime soon. So the housing and mining booms have created inequality and concentrated reward in a small sector of the economy, which has stifled risk-taking, innovation, investment in other sectors, and loaded risk onto a section of the population with no assets and no wealth, people who are forced out to the outskirts of our cities, who accumulate large debt, and who can't cope when old age and disability strike. There's been a few ideas thrown around about how we confront this. I think the focus needs to be on urgently identifying and building new industries that can contribute to sustained productivity growth and export income. We're at the end of the mining boom, and we need a clear plan for where growth will come from in the coming decades. I think the way forward is investment, long-term investment in economic development and growth, supported by institutions that distribute opportunity and reward in our economy as widely and equally as possible. Luckily, Labor's got a plan which accepts that the same tired old neoliberal policy prescriptions are not going to work in a rapidly changing world. And of course, neither will slogans like innovation and agility, completely unsupported by any kind of substantive policy agenda. We need a new way forward. As the candidate for Australia's fastest growing and soon to be largest city, I should point out that cities will be key drivers in the new economy and key centres for job creation and innovation, but of course equally areas where the pressures of unaffordable housing, congestion, poor planning and growing inequality will be felt most acutely. I do want to use the F word this evening, that word would be feminism, to talk about how I think Labor needs to position itself to deal with some of these challenges. I think that equality and equal opportunity need to be central to the mission and purpose of the Australian Labor Party once again. And I think a modern Labor Party should be underpinned by a renewed commitment to social liberalism, social democracy and feminism. This is because Labor is the party of social justice, human rights and inequality in this country. And the truth is that there is no single factor that is more likely to guarantee that you will experience discrimination or disadvantage on this planet than being born a girl. It is estimated that about 1 in 3 women in Australia have experienced physical violence, and 1 in 5 have experienced sexual violence. If I had a daughter, she would be more likely to be sexually assaulted than to grow up to be a CEO or a federal politician. It is a national disgrace. The gender pay gap hovers somewhere between 17 and 19%. I should acknowledge that today the Royal Commission into Family Violence report was presented to the Victorian Parliament, and Daniel Andrews is to be commended for agreeing to accept every single one of the 227 recommendations, which is a fantastic start, and Malcolm Turnbull should take heed. In every society since humans crawled from the primordial soup, in every culture, in every country, girls and women have fared worse than their male counterparts on almost every single social indicator. Gender equality is one of the most pervasive, widespread, entrenched forms of inequality on earth. We need some serious soul searching to address this issue, and it requires every single one of us to reflect on how we are either intentionally or inadvertently playing into harmful gender stereotypes that reinforce and perpetuate the disadvantaged position of women in the world. And most importantly, we need men to hand over power to women, including good progressive men who support the cause of gender equality. And this of course, is where the rubber hits the road. But we will simply not make the progress we need to for gender equality or for any of the other challenges that face our country until women hold power and speak for themselves. So Labor has a strong tradition of policies aimed at reducing gender inequality, but I think it's vital that such policies are central to Labor's mission and purpose and process of policy development, rather than being secondary considerations or a policy subset. I think gender equality must be a core part of Labor's commitment to economic and social justice. Quotas and anti-discrimination laws are all very well and good, but if Labor concurrently embraces policy prescriptions which disproportionately disadvantage women in the marketplace, the purpose is defeated. Women are clearly disadvantaged by neoliberal policy prescriptions like privatisation and deregulation. They end up bearing for free the burden of cut services. But even traditional social democracy has focused on protecting male workers. The point was made before about the harvester judgment. Labor and the labour movement have traditionally embraced a class-based male breadwinner model of equality. The living wage promoted in the harvester decision was a wage sufficient for a male breadwinner to support his wife and children. So gendered inequality was built into our wage fixing principles right up until the Equal Pay case of 1972. For a time, centralised wage fixing helped women, because women are generally in lower paid industries and they were brought up to a reasonable level by centralised wage fixing. But then the shift under Hawke and Keating to enterprise bargaining weakened women's position in the workplace. Quite simply, agreements in female-dominated workplaces paid less. Women's units in government, established by Labor governments, and women's community groups foresaw these developments, but the male-dominated union movement foresaw gains for their members and perhaps did not show the solidarity with women workers that we might have hoped for. Labor did include equal pay protections in industrial laws, but the requirement to prove discrimination with all the legal technicality that involves meant the provisions did nothing to stop the pay gap increasing. Julia Gillard fixed this in 2009, and she removed the requirement to prove discrimination, and the ASU brought a famous equal pay case on behalf of community sector workers. The ASU won the case, funding agreements were negotiated, and the coalition promptly reversed the funding decisions before they had any chance to make a meaningful difference. So I'm looking forward to the next Labor government reversing it back. Gough acknowledged that Labor was a male-dominated party in a male-dominated parliament in a male-dominated society, and he made a serious effort to modernise Labor's vision of equality so that it could address other forms of disadvantage beyond class. We must finish the work that Gough started and fully rid ourselves of any suggestion that women, ethnics or refugees are not really part of Labor's constituency if we are to confront the challenges of the coming decades as a modern, inclusive, socially democratic party. Attempts to ensure that Labor stays focused on its working class heartland rather than pandering to politically correct inner city elites has a gendered, homophobic undertone which we should be very, very wary of. Women workers are some of the most underpaid and mistreated workers in this country and around the world, and Labor has to confront this injustice head on and reclaim a more gender inclusive social democratic tradition. So in terms of how we fix it for the next election, I think what I'm very pleased to see is Labor's Growing Together platform. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see it. Jenny Macklin released it recently. It is the kind of policy thinking we've been crying out for. It's long term, it's detailed, it's serious. It acknowledges that developing new policy approaches to unpaid caring and family work is one of the biggest challenges faced by the ALP and social democratic parties around the world. Sorry?
Let's see it.
Yes, well, let's see it. We've got to get elected first. Encouraging women's participation in the workforce by cutting single parent benefits and providing training packages just doesn't work, and it didn't work when Keating tried it because decent jobs for women just weren't available. And compounding that, women still remain largely responsible for unpaid caring, family and community work, which renders them incapable of taking up the decent jobs, even if they were there. Instead, we need to think about the type of policies that will shape our labour markets in more gender equitable ways, including investing in early childhood and care, early childhood education and care, implementing strong and gender neutral paid parental leaves provisions, and enforceable flexible working arrangements. And of course, addressing harmful gender stereotypes which deem women primarily responsible for vital family and community work. As I said, growing together is the kind of serious long-term thinking our community has been crying out for. It is an attempt to build foundations to reduce inequality, to tackle poverty, to generate full employment in this country, and shift power, importantly, to communities. It acknowledges the gendered nature of casualisation and job insecurity, which Kelvin spoke about. Job insecurity and casualisation predominantly affects women, or largely affects women, and it acknowledges the need to think about new ways of providing the care that has traditionally been provided for free by women. One thing I was going to talk about is superannuation, and the fact that, despite the contribution that women make, the incredibly vital contribution they make throughout their lives to our societies, they often end up living in poverty because their unpaid work renders them incapable of saving for their retirement. And I'm very pleased to see Labor introducing some very brave reforms to superannuation, which will go a long way to addressing this inequality by getting rid or reducing overly generous superannuation concessions. Lastly, I'll finish by putting in a bit of a wish list, just one item. I think that the federal government should take the Victorian government's lead and establish a federal portfolio for equality. I think that inequality is right up there with climate change. It's the great moral challenge of our time. We need to, as a Labor Party, embrace an expansive and inclusive definition of equality that acknowledges other struggles outside the workers' struggles. And I think an equality portfolio would ensure that Labor does adopt that expansive definition and make sure that inequality and its consequences are addressed in every single policy platform across the program. Thank you very much.